So, number 4, what are the basic ideas prompting Unity 2020? Let's get back to Bret Weinstein for a moment. Some of his background ideas are very important to understanding why this proposal is being made the way it is. So, what you may have heard him say before, if you've listened to him at all, is the term, he's used the term a lot, rent-seeking elite / rent seekers. This is rhetoric that he has derived, I believe, from his brother Eric Weinstein. If you go to Eric Weinstein's 4-quadrant model, which has been, I think, best detailed in an article by the Medium, Rosa Laura wrote it back in February of 2018. She includes there not just a diagram of the model, not the best diagram, because it's hard to see then where the narratives lie on there, but also definitions of what he is referring to. Rent seekers, she writes, are people or companies who have a vested interest in the X-axis policy, which we'll talk about in 2 seconds, because they profit from it, but do not produce much or anything of value in return. All right, so here's the article. So here's that diagram here, and let me zoom out a little bit so you can see it better. So essentially, what Eric Weinstein did is he created a basic 2-dimensional plane coordinate system to understand the current political atmosphere and its relationship to media, because the claim is, and I agree, that we tend to view things on a one-dimensional spectrum. We look at only an x-axis, which is opposition to a policy initiative, support for policy initiative, or in many cases just left versus right, which is becoming the big deal. Let's be more polarized. Then we have actual moral virtue versus moral vice of the people who we're considering. And the rent-seeking elite then would be in this bottom right quadrant where there is clear moral vice in the sense of corruption, but they often support policy initiatives. They're undercover in a sense in order to get the most gain. They are undercover and don't wish to be out there in the public to be viewed, but rather derive financial benefit from their decisions. So these are called the rent seekers. They do not produce much or anything of value in return necessarily. Can be debated by some people if you want to consider things like major popular media sources I'm not going to get into, or I'm not going to mention here for liability purposes, that then people utilize on an everyday basis. The fact-checking portions of those media sources are what's being interrogated here in part. All right, what you may not have heard Bret Weinstein use before is 2 very important concepts that he actually developed during his PhD, his time as a PhD candidate: indirect reciprocity and stability-dependent cooperation. I highly recommend checking out a couple of things, but among them, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Group Stability, and the Evolution of Moral Tensions. This was an article that he published alongside David Lottie. They co-wrote it, and it ended up being a part of his dissertation. The dissertation itself was Evolutionary Trade-offs, Emergent Constraints, and Their Adaptive Consequences. You can find both of these online. Again, links down below. The article was published by Evolution and Human Behavior as in 2005, and it talks a lot about the evolutionary theory that he relies on to understand, that we can now probably concur is a big part of his understanding of the current atmosphere. But if you go back specifically to the dissertation paper, which is what I recommend doing, you can find it online. Again, I printed off a copy, and you can see that it's well worn. I've gone through this entire thing just to get to that last bit on the better angels and understand it best. So here is an important, I will read it from here. One thing that will help demonstrate these concepts best is probably his boat race analogy. So I'll spare you the details of the evolutionary theory at large, but here's what he says. Consider a boat race in which a number of multi-rower craft... Try that again. Consider a boat race in which a number of multi-rower crafts race against each other over a predetermined course. Prize money is divided such that the first vote receives 50% of the total and the second vote receives 50% of the remainder, and so on down the standings. Within each vote, the position of each rower dictates what fraction of the vote's total winnings are his, such that the person in the first seat gets 50% of the vote's total, the person in the second seat gets 50% of what remains, and so on down the vote. Skip a little bit. The rules permit individuals alone or in collaboration to dislodge boatmates from superior seats, but as a practical matter, this cannot be accomplished while rowing. In such a race, one can easily imagine that as boats fall behind, they will be overcome by a sense of shared fate and the need to cooperate intensely so that they will have something substantial to divide. As any boats pull ahead, individuals in the back of that boat, who stand to gain little from the win, will reasonably conclude that bettering their own standing within the boat is the best use of their efforts. Cooperation between competitors in the back of the boat is likely to arise, and breakdown of such alliances is increasingly probable as they move closer to the front of the boat and more prize money is at stake. So in other words, those who are in the back of the boat want to get to the front of the boat, and those who are in boats farther back are just looking to push as hard as they can to race forward and get closer to the front. And in this boat race analogy, he's trying to make the case that we rely on a stability-dependent cooperation, he calls it, version of, we rely on this cooperation in order to help stabilize group dynamics. And we do that in part through this moral tension of what to do depending on which boat we're in and where that boat is placed in the water. That moral tension of, do we uphold certain morals, or do we worry about how can we confer the or aggregate the most amount of dividends from the race. So he also talks very importantly about group collapse. So let me read that as well real quick. One exception to the trend of stability-dependent cooperation follows from the fact that humans, although highly dependent on their groups, are not absolutely so. When stability is so low that the group might be doomed to dissolution, group members may consider the benefits of leaving the group to be greater than the benefits of serving it. Moreover, as individuals cease striving for the group, when they believe the cause is lost, they will be accelerating the collapse of the group, both by their withdrawal of aid and by the effects of that withdrawal on the assessments of others. This consideration indicates a threshold effect with a sharp decline in cooperation, and the self-fulfilling group dissolution once hopelessness of group persistence begins to spread. The existence of this tendency depends on perceived probability of successfully integrating into new groups following past group failures. Where there is no such hope, individuals would be expected to go down with the ship, continuing to employ the only strategy with any apparent chance of success. He then talks about the zero-sum and non-zero-sum dynamics, and that he's looking at it in a especially zero-sum game. And in this sense, that's true. It's zero-sum in the sense that one party wins and the other party loses, and we simply get the policy measures and the cabinets or administrations of those parties, one or the other. So group collapse is really important to understand. He's saying that given certain circumstances like today, where people are within the boats towards the front of the race, we can bet that those that are in a position to lose the most are going to be promoting the idea that we have group stability. Things are great. Look at this past presidency. Look at what wonderful things have happened. And we come to, of course, through fact-checking, find out that's often not the case. Meanwhile, the actual issues involved that are causing group instability, such as recent events with the anti-racist movement and the COVID-19 issue, is really also, it's bringing us to a head to where we either have to believe in the current instantiation of leadership, which is not really leadership, the candidate Trump here, and the scenario that he would usher in, and say, is it really as great as this? Are we really keeping America great again? Because that's going to be the rhetoric there. Meanwhile, Biden is, of course, going to be offering an entirely different rhetoric, because, not just because he's not in the position, in the seat, the White House, but because he's also on the side where leadership and power are most possible, provided they get that seat. And so really pushing for the instability of the system and so on and so forth, year after year, or not year after year, but election period after election period, we see the same rhetoric precisely because this is how group stability works. So a lot of the change that Biden would seem to usher in, but doesn't necessarily seem to be backed up by the evidence of his past policies and track record and his current pandering to specific target audiences for gain in that way, it all sort of fits into this model for Bret Weinstein's promotion of this idea.